Well, good afternoon. We'll get started here. It's nice to be here and have an opportunity to talk about a project that we've operated for the past 4 years. It was in implementation for 3, and then the last year was conducting analysis here in Nashville, Tennessee, in the Metropolitan Nashville Public School System. Before we get into the actual PowerPoint and into the findings and the design and structure of the program that we had implemented, there's a table over there. We have round tables for them. We wanted to get them something special instead of the straight tables. But it's many of the individuals from the school district, from the school board, from the local public education foundation, the Nashville Alliance. It's individuals who came forward and said, we just want to know. We just want to know what the impact is of the opportunity for a teacher to earn a significant financial incentive on student test scores. The TEA, the MNEA, a huge number of organizations were involved from day one and have been involved throughout. And so for those individuals, we can't thank them enough. The number of phone calls they have probably taken, they don't, it's nice to still see them here today. So thank you very much. So in terms of the outline that we're going to go through today, it's pretty straightforward, and then we're going to jump into mostly question and answer. During the question and answer session, all we ask is that when you do come up, if you could just state your name, who you're with, and then one of the 3 of us will be able to respond to that. I should say Dale Ballou, who's closest to me there, is from Vanderbilt University. He's an economist and led a large part of the design and the analysis phase of the project. Dan McCaffrey from the RAND Corporation is representing about 8 other RAND people who are on the project. Dan's the head statistician at RAND, is among the individuals who understands value added more probably than anyone in the country. And then up front we have Jim Guthrie, who was our original partner in this project, and it's great to see him back in Nashville. As I mentioned in the introduction, POINT was really just designed to test whether providing a significant incentive would change the way in which a teacher could approach their job and ultimately impact student test scores. And what we mean by significant incentives is prior to implementing this project, I think every program that we pretty much looked at rewarded teachers a maximum of $3,000. In this project, we set a baseline of $5,000 was the minimum, and the maximum was $15,000. It was set as a randomized control trial. We went out to middle school math teachers in September of 2006. We went through a recruitment process where trained research associates spent an entire day in schools to answer any questions that math teachers had about the program, and then they would sign up. 296 teachers, or approximately 70% of those eligible, signed up. They were then randomized into control, which is life as usual, or a treatment or bonus eligible condition, where depending upon the performance or the growth of their students during that current academic year, they could win a bonus. And we had at least 1 control and 1 treatment teacher in 38 of Metro's 40 schools, and that's in year 1. At the beginning of the project, there was a significant amount of time that we had spent negotiating the design. There's many people and individuals involved, and we set a few standards that the design had to meet. One of those is that teachers would not compete against one another. Historically, teacher pay for performance programs had been set up as a fixed tournament. You could have a math teacher next to you, you're teaching math, you don't want to share your best lesson plan, because essentially that teacher could also be taking bonus money away from you. We also wanted to make sure that the awards were given at the individual level. The discussions we had emphasized that we wanted everyone to be able to elect in on their own, but we also didn't want to have a vote where if 70% said yes, then everybody has to do it, even though 30% might not have been in favor. And so we went to the individual level for the unit of accountability. We also said that teachers would be evaluated based on the progress of their students as measured by TCAP, which is the state's high-stakes assessment, and that the performance thresholds to earn a bonus weren't so high to discourage those who felt they're far away. They weren't so low that we had to spend a tremendous amount of money, and there's some gauging there so we could do that. And then the maximum bonuses, as I said during the introduction, had to be large. At the beginning of the project as well, we took 3 years of data. We calculated using a similar strategy to how we calculated a teacher's value-added effect estimate in order to determine their bonus during the treatment years. But we did this before the experiment was even implemented. And so we were able to establish historical benchmarks that teachers had to hit in order to reach bonus status. What we found is that when we established it at the 80th percentile, a teacher would receive $5,000. If a teacher hit the 85th percentile of past performance, they would receive $10,000. And if a teacher hit the 95th percentile, they would receive $15,000. When we began the project as well, discussions seemed to suggest that most middle school math teachers only taught math. When we received the data and began to look at it, it became quite clear, particularly in 5th and 6th grade, that most taught math and something else. So we developed a bonus system that would actually adjust downward a teacher's bonus if their students in these other subjects didn't meet the average performance gain in the district that year. And that came up quite a bit as well. In the next slides, we'll show you that a few teachers had their total bonus amounts reduced. As I mentioned for the performance measure, it was going to be based upon a value-added measure from students from year to year on TCAP. The other issue that we really faced during the design phase was, should we use a simple measure or a complex measure? A complex measure is going to be a little bit more precise. A simple measure is possibly something a teacher could maybe understand a little bit better in terms of how that calculation took place. And we met with some teachers, and we came down on the side that we wanted to use a simple measure of value added. We feel as though that information could actually help with the incentive effect of the program. And in fact, a teacher could calculate that bonus themselves, in essence, if they had their students' test scores and some benchmarks. The one thing we did have to do is from the state each year, we received state benchmark gains based upon if a student had a 240 in 5th grade in 2006, we needed to know the average of that student's score the next year on the same test in math. And they averaged that across the whole state, and that became the target. So what you'll see here, and this is just hypothetical example, but this is literally what the teacher's bonus report would look like. You see on the left-hand side here a series of student names. The first score is actually going to be their prior year score, and in this particular situation, Jay Smith, who had a 250. That next year, in 2007, every student who scored a 250 on the math TCAP, on average, scored a 270. So 1 year's worth of academic growth in this instance would be 20 points. In the fourth column over, we see individual 2007 math TCAP score, which is a 285. And the next column over, it says 15. So in this instance, Jay Smith exceeded expectations of 1 year's worth of growth by 15 points. And the teacher was credited for those 15 points. We do this for every single teacher within the class. We go down. The table gets cut off, but it does average out to +7. If at the 85th percentile, for example, is about 3.7 was the 85th percentile value-added score for historical performance. What this shows here is the bonus award distribution by year. The top column is going to show you the number of treatment teachers who were in the experiment. We started in the first year with roughly 143. By the end of the experiment, there was only 84 teachers left in the treatment condition. I will note with that, in the treatment condition, only one teacher in the entire experiment asked to be removed. All other teachers either became no longer eligible because they changed grades and were no longer teaching middle schools. They no longer had 10 students in their class. That was one of the things that we always had to have at least 10 students enrolled in their math course that are expected to take the spring TCAP test. And some teachers, in fact, move back to teaching, let's say, English for the rest of the year. You also can see that it was pretty constant across times. We range between 40 and 44 teachers receive a bonus every year. The bonuses averaged between $9,000 and $11,000. And over the course of the 3 years, we ended up spending about $1.27 million on bonuses. In terms of data collection activities, it's very important to understand that in addition to the survey data, which we have a tremendous amount of surveys that we've administered, a spring survey in year 1, a fall and spring survey in year 2, same thing in year 3. We conducted some interviews as well, but we're very fortunate to have developed a relationship with the district in order to be able to build a very comprehensive data warehouse in where historically things were siloed in different places, whether it was a professional development database or whether it was the attendance database. All these pieces we were able to pull together. We were able to track individual logons onto ThinkLink, which is a formative assessment. Teachers can log on to a site, and they're able to download and see how frequently a teacher did that. We also administered a check sheet list to math mentors just to see the frequency with which they encountered teachers during an academic year. The other piece that became really critical in this process is just knowing, do we have the right data? Because obviously we're relying on student-teacher linkages. But do we really know what students are nested within which teachers' classrooms? Now, we thought at first before we started digging into it, we said, sure, of course we do. We have our month-by-month course snapshots. It gets recorded. We know who they are. But to test this idea, we actually sent every single teacher a list of every single student by class that they instructed. And we asked them, go through this list. Every student on this list should be continuously enrolled in your class from the 20th day of school until the day of TCAP testing. And if you don't think it meets that, let us know. What you see is we created about 143 teacher rosters in the first year. That's the top row up here. In the first year, 55 teachers came back with appeals. The appeals process was then turned over to a district staff member who was able to go through a series of data that we didn't have access to in order to confirm what happened or even to reach out to school site-based individuals who were handling the data issues. Sometimes we didn't approve those changes. The good news is that over time, the information systems greatly improved in the district, but there were instances where whole classes weren't being represented. So if we go into a performance management, or if we go into a pay-for-performance program, or if we make high-stakes personnel decisions based upon the linkages that are not validated, we might not even be making the right decision just because the data is inaccurate. In terms of findings, we're going to skip the findings. We're not going to go through the methods piece, and there's some other things that we can talk about in terms of threats to validity, but we'll open that up when we have our questions as a team here. We don't find a significant difference overall in mathematics test scores between students whose teachers were assigned to the control group and teachers who were assigned to the treatment group. We do not see any significant differences when we look at the effect by grade, 6, 7, 8. We do find a positive effect in grade 5 in years 2 and 3 of the experiment, and it ranged from about 1/2 to 2/3 a year's worth of typical mathematics growth, which is quite large. However, we don't see this effect persist when the 5th grader goes on to 6th grade. That we no longer see the difference. The one caveat here is that we still don't have the data from this most current year, so it's just for that one cohort, and we'll go back and look into this to see if it's different. Now, some people may be quickly raising their head going, was there cheating or was there something else going on? We did a suspicious answer string analysis. Every year we looked at the percentage of types of students going between classrooms Were students excluded on test day? In none of the typical things that we know about in the literature came up to suggest even close to any type of opportunistic behavior. So, given this lack of persistence in the finding, we don't quite know how much weight to put on it. And we can also talk a little bit about some of the additional tests that we did to further explore what is happening in 5th grade, looking at the proportion of teachers who instruct all students or what percentage of their students and so forth. In terms of teacher attitudes, there's few significant differences on the surveys in terms of teacher attitudes, beliefs, practices, and perceptions of the school environment when we compare the treatment and control teachers. For the most part, the control and treatment teachers' responses didn't change over time, although teachers were generally supportive of the program itself. Roughly 80% of all teachers in the treatment group said that they had been working as hard as they're already working as hard as they could, and that the bonus would not affect their behavior. With that said, we'll open up for questions. Hopefully there will be many questions to ask, but thank you. And I forgot to acknowledge that my undergraduate public policy course is here, so if nobody asks questions, we can ask them to come up and ask questions.
I'm Robin Chait with the Center for American Progress. I'm wondering if you looked at the impact of the program on teacher retention.
Slide you talk about that?
And do you want to talk about the significance of it in terms of the different types of teachers who came and left? Or left?
Yeah. Okay.
So, let me just...
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So just in terms of the attrition itself by treatment status, there's two places in which we really see differences in the number of teachers when comparing treatment and control and where they're going. So the top slide is obviously going to show how many teachers left the experiment at the end of the school year by year across with treatment and control. The bottom figure is now going to show what happened, where did they go? So we're able to track what happened. The first 5 columns there are actually what we're going to call change in assignment. They're either no longer teaching, they retired, they're out of grade, they're no longer instructing math, or they left the district. The other is eligibility criteria. So they either dropped out of the experiment, and it should be a 0 there on one of those, or they had less than 10 students. And we see slight differences between left MNPS and those who did not, and we see slight differences with those who were no longer not teaching, but still within the district, typically moving to an administrative position. The issue becomes we're dealing with very small samples here. So if we're starting to look at do we retain more effective teachers, there's a lot of variance, and it's going to be very difficult to see anything. And I'll let Dan did a series of analyses, and I don't know if he wants to add something.
No, the only thing I want to add is that overall the differences in the attrition from the study were only significant after year 2. They weren't significant after year 3. But I think it's really important to think about, as Matt showed, that those differences, the people who leave the study for many reasons, and most of those are not the kind of retention that I think you were trying to get at, which is, retention in the teaching field. That to leave the study was a much easier thing than leaving the teaching profession, because the teacher, if they just taught too few math students, stopped teaching math, switched to another grade or another subject, all those things would have them actually leave the study, but they wouldn't leave the teaching profession. So our study wasn't designed to answer the question about whether we could attract teachers or whether we could retain teachers. It was designed to answer the question about what the effect of the bonus would be on their students' outcomes. And so we don't really answer that question.
Kimberly Fondino, Lebanon Community Schools, Lebanon, Oregon. Just have a couple of questions about the two parts. One is, was the professional development offered to all teachers across the district uniformly as it would have been normally, or was there special training for the control group? And number two is, were there any questions to the teachers about what would have encouraged them to do something different or new? Because you're saying 80% say that they're doing as much as they can. Was there any conversation about if there was anything that could have been changed in their training, anything that could have been done differently that would have encouraged them to have different results?
Well, professional development wasn't part of this project. We simply altered the incentives that teachers had, and it was up to them to decide what, if anything, they wanted to do differently. So we didn't offer professional development to control teachers that was different from what treatment teachers got. There was just nothing of that kind. As far as asking them, just to clarify, the survey asked them whether they, would be making changes in their the way they taught in response to being eligible for a bonus, and as Matt has indicated already, the vast majority responded that they were already doing the best job they could and didn't anticipate making any changes. So we didn't go on then and ask, well, what might we have done to affect your professional life that would have motivated you? That's actually a very interesting question, but not one that we addressed.
And we also looked at things, the professional development database. Did we see different professional development, teachers pursuing different professional development opportunities as well?
Hi, I'm Cynthia Osborne from UT Austin. I had a question about whether you were able to look back before 2006, especially for those teachers who did get these bonuses, to look kind of a little bit more just at the treatment effect. But did they show any difference, or can you look at that data to see if they showed any difference in what they were actually doing? So I understand the difference between treatment and control groups and so forth. But you had some who were receiving this bonus. Did it change their behaviors at all, or teaching?
We don't have any surveys from before the experiment. Now, that would have been nice if we'd maybe had a preliminary year before we launched the experiment to have collected a lot of baseline data.
But you have some of the value-added data.
We do have test scores for these teachers from before the experiment. And we have looked to see whether there are differences between the test scores pre-experiment and post-experiment. And it's difficult to analyze those data because we actually have two pre-experiment years when we have those data, and what we find is those performance measures are really unstable even within those 2 years. Yeah. So the notion that you could extrapolate from that information before the experiment and say, well, if there hadn't been these incentives, we would have just seen a continuation of what we had been seeing, because what we had been seeing itself was unstable. So it's difficult to extrapolate from those 2 years. We're very hesitant to draw conclusions based on those kinds of comparisons.
Well, that was kind of what leads to the second question I had, which you have the same number of teachers about each year receiving the bonuses, but are they the same teachers?
There's a lot of overlap. There are a lot of repeat winners, but there's also quite a few people who would just win once. So it's a mixed bag.
And 33% of those teachers won a bonus in at least 1 year.
Punita Thurman from Fort Worth ISD. One of the challenges I'm struggling with is philosophically, this study sort of outlines a philosophy as a teacher improvement strategy, which philosophically I don't believe, but I'm wondering if there is data or context that you can provide in terms of how the potential of earning this extra money affected the pipeline of teachers that were interested in coming to these schools, if there was a higher either in-district transfer to these schools and grades, or if externally there was a strong communication to use it as a recruiting tool.
We specifically said if you weren't around at the start of the experiment, you were not eligible, so that we wouldn't have a problem of people coming into schools, trying to enter in a slot that was a treatment slot. That would create all kinds of selection issues. We might start seeing differences between treatment and control groups that had nothing to do with improved performance, was simply certain kinds of teachers managing to get into the most favorable positions. So nobody was permitted to enter the experiment after it started in year one, so we have absolutely nothing to say on that question.
And I'll add, too, because it's come up in the questions in a few other places where we've talked with either a technical working group or with funders of the project. And if we just take a trip back in time, even though it's 4 or 5 years ago when we were designing this experiment, the policy push and the focus was to replicate a business-type model of pay for performance. It was to use an objective measure of student performance to evaluate teacher. It was to give a big bonus. There was a lack of incentives in the system. So if we think about the two theories or the two pieces that are really going to drive, when we talk about incentives and pay reform, one is what we'll say is the selection or compositional effect, and can that change who enters the profession? Can that alter who leaves the profession? It sends a signal to those who may not be meeting expectation or who are meeting expectation. We're not set up to test that. The other piece was this behavioral one. And I think wrongly so, some people say work harder, right? Maybe just try something differently. And that's what we're set up to test. And that's where, we go back 3-4 years, that was the policy focus. Value added came on the scene, and people really pushed for it to be used. And we set out to test whether that was a good policy or not.
I'm Cindy Simonson from Anacortes School District in the state of Washington. And first of all, I want to thank you for really working hard to do a really good research project that helps inform us in education. I thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I'm not concerned personally in our area about retention, and that was not what your study was about. So I think your study was about trying to link performance to student achievement, because you were adding money and trying to have people get better results for academic learning. So it would have been wonderful if you had seen that money could change that, because then it would be easy to improve academic performance, because money's easier to get to than a lot of other intangibles. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about what you might study next, because I appreciate the work you've done, and I'm hoping you have some really good ideas for your next steps, and that your community who supported you will continue to support you to help us inform what we can do to help our teachers in getting better student performance. So put on your thinking caps, and what might you study next to help inform us as we make decisions?
There's any number of ways we can approach it, but I think we have to think harder about how we integrate the strategic compensation system within the existing organizational structure of schools. Right? As policymakers, we're always looking for the magic bullet, something that's not too complex, but that's really going to improve student outcomes in the educational system. There could be PD components attached to it. There could be team awards. There could be within-school team awards. There could be school level. Multiple measures. How much information does a teacher need throughout the year to know how they're performing relative to a benchmark? We could go on and on with these pieces, but yes, we're looking towards the next step and have a bunch of ideas that we hope to pursue.
Kimberly Fandino again. Actually, I was just discussing with a colleague over here, and we had a question. Was there any research done as to whether or not the length of experience of teaching had something to do with it? For example, was it more amongst people who have experience and more tools in their toolbox who were able to earn the bonuses, or was it the newer teachers who were willing to try more things? Or did you do any research that showed that particular years of experience in education portion?
Well, that's a good question, and there's a lot of questions just like that you can start to raise. Are there certain types of teachers that responded differently from others? And we have only begun to sort of pursue that because there's so many possibilities. My expectation is that when you start trying to look at ever more finely differentiated subgroups of teachers to see if there's an effect here but not an effect over there, you're very quickly going to run into the problem. The numbers of teachers in the study will get small. And as those numbers get small, you have to find an even bigger difference before it starts to look statistically significant. And I'm skeptical right now that we're ever going to be able to say too much about that type of question. But the one you raise, that's certainly one of the ones we're going to look at.
And as we said in the presentation too, novice teachers just on survey data were more favorable than teachers with more years of experience.
My question was around the applicability of your study results, because I just want to make sure that we're clear. This was pay for performance, measuring performance as only student test data and not anything else. You all did not look at evaluation components. You did not look at professional development, because the headline that comes out of this in terms of as a researcher and what we do with the information that you find is that the only thing that we can conclude from what this study has shown is that using student test data as the only measure of performance did not seem to correlate to increased student achievement, with test data being the only measurement of student achievement.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and we've emphasized in many places that there's two sentences to the story. And one is that we do not detect an effect of this program on student outcomes. But the second sentence becomes, the existing compensation system for teachers is broken. We know we're spending 60 to 80% of a district's operational expenditures in a way that has no systematic correlation to student outcomes. If student outcomes is the policy of interest, if that's what we are trying to do as schools, and we think about sitting on Wall Street, are you going to invest in that company? Most likely not, but that's what we're living within. The other piece I want to push on this a little bit more is we can go back to the 1864. There's a quote from a superintendent arguing for pay for performance. In virtually every decade since the 1950s, we've had some push, some systematic push for merit pay, pay for performance. We have never set out to systematically study it in a rigorous way in order to learn from it until we implemented this experiment in 2006. In 2007, the colleague Mike Prodersky and I reviewed the literature. We could only find 8 studies that evaluated a pay for performance program, and that was using a moderate bar of evidence. 4 of those studies came from abroad. So part of the takeaway here is we're building knowledge. This is the first time that we can say we have some evidence. We know teachers didn't revolt against the system. We know they didn't feel like as though the collaborative culture was breaking down. They stuck through it for all 3 years. We did it collaboratively with an incredible group of individuals. But again, we don't know what the system should look like, and we don't even know if it would work if we do try these other systems.
Carla Stevens, Houston. I too want to thank you all for doing the study. It does help to increase the body of knowledge of what we have when you all do things like this. The only thing that I would just like to caution, I too am concerned about the headlines that will come from this, because I know that in our district, and I also know in some other districts that I'm very familiar with, we've used performance pay as a way to help change and transform what we're doing in our district. And it wasn't just putting performance pay in that we were looking at. That wasn't the only thing we changed. But having performance pay helped to really focus and get the attention of everybody to the changes that we were doing in the district. Like specifically, we were moving from getting everybody looking at achievement and just passing rates to actually looking at value-added growth of every individual child in their classroom and in the district as a whole. Using performance pay helped get them galvanized around making that change, because it really is a a whole paradigm shift of moving from looking at achievement to looking at the growth of every child, and not just trying to get your passing rates and focusing on the bubble kids, but actually moving all of the children in the system. Had we not had performance pay, I don't think we would have nearly have gotten the kind of galvanized growth around paying attention to that if we'd have just said, okay, now we want everyone to focus on growth instead of achievement. I don't think it would have happened. When we tied significant dollars to it, now it got their attention, and it has really changed the conversations that are going on in the classroom. It's changed the conversations that are happening district-wide. It's changed the conversations that parents are having with their schools. I'm just concerned that when we say something like this, that performance pay does not change teacher behavior. And I agree with, how your study was designed. It was a very clean, very straightforward study. All you were looking at was just that as the treatment. I just caution the media who are here or anyone who might take this information and say, then blanket as a whole, performance pay doesn't work. I would caution them to say that it might actually be a good thing to help use to galvanize a system to move in another direction, which that isn't something that you all focused on, because then that really would make your study all messy. And I know, because it's really hard for us to try to evaluate what we've done, because we've changed a whole system and we've changed a lot of the inputs. So I don't really know that there's a question, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to just caution people in how they respond to the results of this, and just kind of throw this back to you all as to how you would respond if you were me, and I may end up having to deal with my media when they come to me and say, oh, look what Vanderbilt has found. How do we deal with that?
I would just say, too, our media strategy clearly outlines that. I mean, that's almost bullet point one. But I don't know, Dale, if you have things to add or...
Well, we agree with you. We share your concern. Just because we didn't find an effect of altering these incentives the way we did it doesn't mean you wouldn't get an effect from doing it another way, and you clearly have done it another way. So we completely agree that the implications of these findings should not be overstated. I would also just like to add that we didn't design this experiment the way we did it simply because, or for the sole reason that this was clean. I mean, we could have designed a more complicated intervention and tested that. We selected this because we thought this was an idea whose time had come, in the sense that a lot of people were saying the lack of incentives is a fundamental problem. And if you could get the incentives right, surely something good would happen as a result. Even if you didn't accompany it with all the other sorts of changes you described, something surely would result in a positive way simply from fixing these incentives. And so we went after that, because we thought that idea now has become so common, at least at the time we designed this, it was heard so frequently, that we thought we surely need a test of that simple idea. So that's why we did what we did, and what we found is that alone doesn't appear to generate the kinds of positive responses we were hoping to get, or one would hope to get.
I'm back again. I'm sorry, but I have to ask this question. I have to put this out here. Yesterday I mentioned to the group here if they had read Daniel Fink's work on drive and on motivation. And one of the things that he talked about was when they gave 3 groups of women who they had asked them if they would be willing to give blood. And they said they divided them into 3 groups. In one group they paid, one group they gave nothing, and one group they said they could either pay them or they would allow them to donate the money to charity right away. And the 2 groups that had money involved decreased in the amount of work, or of amount of choices to actually donate the blood, because we were taking away the intrinsic choice of doing something for the right reason. And it actually decreased the motivation in the people who would have actually voluntarily given blood. I honestly believe that the frustration I have as a teacher, educator for 16 years, also an administrator moving forward with professional development, is that We treat our teachers like missionaries, asking them to do everything that it takes, to do everything that it costs, to push everything to the final limits, and then we turn around and we throw money at them and talk about test scores, rather than saying, let's take care of their needs and train them the way we want them to go. At what point are we going to do a study about the impact on effective professional development rather than scattershoot or spray and pray, and just really actually bringing that back to the professional development that's needed to produce increased test scores rather than just money?
Hi, Paul Helder, Grand Rapids, Michigan. First, I guess I just want to say thank you for the work here. I know that was a lot of effort. I know probably there were some people who thought it would go the other way, and that it can't be easy to make the announcement in the middle of this symposium to do that. But I appreciate it, and that's what good academics is. And so I wanted to thank you for that. Also, I just received information that this study, in fact, kind of backs up, if you will, or agrees with two others that just came out. The Economic Policy Institute and has a study out there saying essentially that value-added programs don't work, I think was the comment made earlier. And then the Department of Education through Mathematica did a study that said the same thing. I guess my question then would be, we do a lot of research into what can we do to change the teachers? What can we do to, I don't know, make them work harder or give them more training or dangle money in front of them, whatever it may be. And how will this affect scores? But my question is, have we done any real research to see what kind of impact things like shared decision-making make for students in a district or a building? Have we done any real studies to look at how a sense of ownership or empowerment for teachers and educational leaders and a sense of community could help impact achievement? And if not, would you be willing to pick up the ball and run with it?
Well, when you say real study, you're defining real study to mean a controlled experiment?
That's exactly what I would suggest. I don't know if there's a way to do that, or, failing that, I suppose you'd have to rely on a lot of anecdotal stuff.
I think
surveys.
you would get mad at us.
Well, I don't know. I'm not aware of any experiments of that nature, but we are the National Center on Performance Incentives, so we do have a mission here, and I don't know that we can
Can
kind of
decision making be an incentive? Okay, thank you.
The one thing I'll add to it is too in that split there is I think that the EPI report you're probably referencing is more of a review of the literature, where the Mathematica study was a randomized control trial that was implemented about a year after our project in Chicago Public Schools, and it analyzed the teacher advancement program using a design that had delayed implementation. The evidence is thin. I mean, in Texas, we've done the statewide evaluation work for the state of Texas now for 3 or 4 years. The one thing we've walked away with is student achievement hasn't changed there either. The one difference we have seen, and we're talking thousands and thousands of teachers, is that we actually went out and systematically collected the bonus award amounts that every single teacher within the schools that were participating received. We found that if a teacher received roughly around $1,200 to $1,300 as part of the bonus program, it reduced their predicted probability of turnover significantly. If a teacher received $3,000 or more, it cut their predicted probability of leaving that campus in half. Now, limitation is we don't have value-added scores if we're going to believe that's a good measure of effectiveness. We can't go in the classrooms and observe these teachers. So if those teachers are truly the effective ones who are getting larger bonuses, it seems to have an impact of some sort on whether they leave that school following that year.
My name is Scott Burnett, and I'm a classroom teacher in Anacortes, Washington. And like most teachers, I come with a great deal of skepticism about pay for performance. And all of the evidence, research-based evidence that I've seen, seems to indicate that it's more of a political point of view, and the people who are pushing it have a political agenda, but that the evidence doesn't support the reliability of of either the value added or the pay for performance. And I'm wondering if you can tell me if there's any evidence, or if there's not, why we're having this conversation.
Evidence on exactly
Well,
whether the program...
as you mentioned at the start,
politics,
there
yes.
are studies that show positive effects of incentives. Some of them are overseas. They don't typically involve a controlled experiment. That's not the design. But there is some evidence. So it's not like this was just a straw man that we set out to investigate.
How many teachers in... this probably isn't the best group. We do have incentives in the education system, too.
Right. Oh,
right?
well, that's true. And I'm wondering if there's any study about just actually paying teachers more.
Well,
all teachers.
I mean, incentives in the system are, what's the fastest growing master's degree in the United States? School admin degree, right? How many of those individuals are going to go into the principalship? Not half, because there's not that many schools for them to go into. Yet the amount we're paying in a single district, mid-sized urban district over a 6-year period is going to be over $1 billion just for that premium. So there may be a better way, right? We wish we could step up here today and say, look, there's these great big effects and the world's going to change. It's not going to happen today. The piece is we need to continue moving science forward, and we need to be careful, too, when policy is being implemented along these lines. Too often we implement policy, we then try to find an evaluator after the fact. By the time the evaluator gets in, there's no way we can really say whether it was that program that impacted whatever happened or some other intervening notion.
I also thank you for your research. And like all good research, it's beguiling and prompts curiosity. And I find myself thinking about the Gallup Institute's contribution earlier this morning, where they were talking about students and the characteristics, the deep personal characteristics of hope and well-being, which they're able to measure. And also thinking about my own contribution yesterday, where I referred to the importance of self-reflection, reflective practice, as inspiring teachers to become better teachers. And I quoted, Dewey, who talks about open-mindedness, responsibility, and wholeheartedness as being the key elements of self-reflection. I wonder if it would be possible to shift the variables now and look at two groups, both of which had the pay incentive, but one of which was actually, with the help of Gallup, actually selected because they showed intrinsic elements of something. I mean, I am suggesting self-reflectiveness. It might be described in other ways. Thinking aloud and wanting the research to go on. Thank you.
So are you proposing a study?
Well, no, I mean, I think I feel very flattered that if I've stunned you into silence, that must be a good thing.
Well,
You said
not
Dewey, and I was like, Dewey.
I'm not sure quite what we're thinking here about studying them. If the attempt is to test the hypothesis that teachers with these characteristics are more effective, then presumably first you have to go out and identify teachers who have these characteristics and teachers who don't, and then presumably you have to put them in equivalent environments. So you'd have to randomly assign students to the two types of teachers, and then I suppose set out to see whether we get different results in the end. And I'm not aware of anybody who's thinking about doing that because this doesn't sound like a feasible policy intervention. I mean, fine, even if we identify these are the characteristics that seem to make an effective teacher, we don't have a policy to sort of endow teachers with those characteristics. So the relevant policy would presumably be some sort of screening device to test whether a potential teacher has these characteristics and see whether a district that uses that screening mechanism gets a better workforce than a district that doesn't. So, yeah, I mean, there conceivably are ways that you might set about to test this notion, but they start to me to sound rather complicated and like they might take a rather long time before we would start to see results. If you're thinking about screening new teacher hires, then how many years are you going to wait to get the final answer about which group turned out to be more effective? So it's possible, but that doesn't seem to be sort of, that doesn't seem to be the kind of intervention that is currently grabbing policymakers' thinking. So someday that might be the study we want to do. I don't see it on the immediate horizon.
I agree that you can't obviously bring those characteristics to people that haven't got them. But at the same time, what you're showing here is a differential between those who are motivated and not motivated by money. And you talked about screening, gatekeeping. Mentioned yesterday, that's already something that's being suggested in the UK, that students, undergraduate students, who come through with poorer degrees are not funded to go on into teacher education, because we're seeing that the importance of the profession requires the best caliber postgraduate students. So it could be a gatekeeping device. I mean, it raises all sorts of questions. I'd say no more, but I wanted to introduce it as an idea.
And it's critical we get the information in too. I mean, even if we were to develop the prototype in our head of what a pay-for-performance system may look like, let's think for a second about the private sector. They have huge HR departments, individuals who've gone through specific programs simply to study incentives, compensation systems, and so forth. School districts in large part were not built around performance management. The data system example we showed you was not supportive of a pay-for-performance system per se. The different places we have to go to get that individual information, and then is there the capacity within it to do the calculations that Dan and Dale can do? I mean, they're having those individuals and their pure intellect and how they understand these models. It still took from about mid-June to July when we received the data. We still weren't getting bonus reports out the door till the middle of September. And that's 3 or 4 senior statisticians who specialize in these models doing the calculations. And the system has to develop and has to mature.
Brad Jupp, the United States Department of Education. I want to thank you guys. This is a really important report that is in a growing body of literature that I hope can inform all of us as school district leaders and leaders in the profession as we move forward to try and accomplish the really difficult goals that are ahead of us as we think about improving our nation's schools. 2 quick points and then a question. The first about a question about the Mathematica study that was completed on the behest of the Department of Education. The finding of the Mathematica study was that there is statistical noise in value-added measures, but it also recognizes, and I think this is an important caveat, that there are problems with all other measures. And I think that, in other words, that it is just as difficult to say that we can say a principal's observation, for instance, is a statistically valid and reliable measure of teacher performance. And ultimately what that study does is to place the challenge before us as practitioners to find the right, fair, and just measures to make judgments about teacher performance. And it doesn't discourage us from using evidence of student performance. And I think we need to proceed with that kind of judicious frame of mind as we go forward. I think the second, to Matt's point about incentives in the existing pay system, we need to be mindful of the fact that the existing pay system is an individual incentive system. What the single salary schedule is a set of rewards that motivate you, successfully in some cases, unsuccessfully in others, to do two things: to stay in the system longer. It's not very successful, especially at the beginning of the teaching career, in doing that, incidentally. There's high rates of turnover, which is evidence that the incentive isn't particularly compelling. And to accrue graduate credit. There's a lot of evidence that the incentive to accrue graduate credit is very compelling. And in fact, if you look at the degree of educational attainment of the teaching workforce between 1956 and 2006, something that you can do using NEA data, what you can see is that the teaching workforce went from literally 20% that didn't even have BAs in 1956 and under 20% that had MAs in 1956 to 60% with MAs in 2006 and 40% with BAs in 2006. Now, there are many reasons, many incentives, some of them monetary, some of them other, that drove people from that one composition of the workforce to another. And I'd go on and say that money was one of those incentives. And, to that end, what I think Matt urged us to do when he said that there are two sentences to the study is to consider what, under the present practice, is in fact working to support us in our pursuit of the set of goals that we all have in front of us. To the panel, and thank you for allowing me to make those 2 points, to the panel, what I'd like to do is to ask an important question. This study looks at the motivational effects of incentives, bonuses, on teachers with no other interventions except for the bonuses. And I would ask the panel to respond to two questions or to a question that is related to this point. The first is, could you compose a study around motivational effects that was not simply reliant on a single intervention? And the second is, might you also look at a study that looked at the overall composition of the workforce, and how might that be designed so that you could look at the relationship between incentives and how the workforce was composed over time and how that composition changed? Matt, Professor Ballou, question for you.
Well, on the latter, yes, you could design an experiment that looked like one of these long-term medical trials, and that's what you'd probably need, something that goes for 10 years or so, because if you're trying to create incentives that alter people's career choices, it can't just be a 3-year experiment. So if you offered an incentive to somebody to become a teacher, added to that an additional incentive if they took a job in a difficult environment, added more if they had high value-added results, and told them the money's there in escrow for the next 10 years, it's yours. If you meet these various thresholds, then we could open this up to several thousand college juniors and seniors and see how many take us up on it, and what their career trajectories look like for a 10-year period. And I'd love to do a study like that, but I've got to find somebody who wants to fund it.
That was my big question, too.
Well, and actually, I actually think it's even harder, because I think you need to, you're really trying to change the system, so I'm not even sure you could do it at the individual level. I think you'd have to be thinking of, looking at school systems. That would be part of that. So I think it's an enormous study.
We're going I just got the people in the back waving like that. We'll come right up and answer questions right afterwards, but I do want to address one thing as well. We thought long and hard about presenting this at a conference about evaluating and measuring teacher effectiveness. We knew it might be a little bit quiet after the findings were put up on the screen, but the ways in which we're talking about teacher effectiveness, the ways in which we're talking about evaluating and measuring teacher effectiveness are very different than things that we measured in our experiment. And I think it's critical, if we begin to take this next step and if we begin to look forward of what could be a next experiment, many of these measures that were talked about today, talked about yesterday, are going to have to play a critical role. And not a critical role just for a high stakes decision, but a critical role for a formative decision of being information that teachers can take back into the classroom and continue on to the path of excellence. And so I hope that we have not, towards the end of a conference, put a dark cloud over it, but I really do appreciate the questions and hope you guys have a great rest of the day.